Now, if you're feeling daring, you could call Christian Gottlieb Priber an early communist martyr. And I'm feeling a little bit daring for this video, so here it goes.
Christian Gottlieb Priber was a man of Germanic descent who was up in the area around northern parts of, up northern area around Georgia into the Carolinas, and had tried to unify the Cherokee peoples under this banner of fighting against Britain and becoming essentially a free state.
One of the things I like to bring up about the Battle of Taliwa is that it was fought about 11 years after the death of Christian Gottlieb Priber. Now, Priber was influenced by his understanding of Plato's Republic, and he moved over to the colony of Georgia and decided to go and live with the Cherokee, where he started preaching that they all need to unite, both the Cherokee and the Creek and all tribes in the southeast. And the Creek didn't take too kindly to this, because basically what was happening was that both the Creek and the Cherokee were allied with the British, and the British would play those two tribes against each other and benefit from selling them weapons and arms. British put a hit out on Gottlieb Priber, who's preaching this message of women should have a new husband every day if they so choose. Children should be raised communally. There should be no private ownership, and there should be an end of mercantilism. Gottlieb Priber came over to the British colonies of the New World sometime in the early 1700s and immediately made a beeline for the Cherokee of North Georgia, where he started railing against the corruption of European culture. The Cherokee quickly declared him a beloved man, which was an incredibly high honor usually reserved for warriors and chiefs. And Priber started talking about the need for communal ownership of property. He railed against the idea of European private ownership and of capitalism in general, or mercantilism, which was, of course, supporting the empires of England, France, and Spain to their south. Was he trying to unify all the tribes, or was it mainly a focus on the Cherokee?
That I can't speak to, if it was all the tribes. I think in his contact was, as I understand it, was mostly through the Cherokee peoples. He ends up being caught, and he's actually brought here to Fort Frederica and held in jail here in Fort Frederica. He ends up dying, if I'm not mistaken, of pneumonia or something akin to that, while he's here. He is actually known for being rather stoic, known for being just kind of a singular figure of just kind of a determination. An example of that was that there was one of our arsenals caught fire, and at that point in time, the arsenal actually exploded as a result of the fire. And when that occurred, supposedly he just kind of sat straight up in his jail cell as if nothing had faced him whatsoever. So, these explosions are ongoing, and he was just stoically sitting there. He dies soon following that, and supposedly is buried in our old burying ground. At least that's the belief. We don't know if that's true or not. I mean, the reason that we don't know if it's true or not is we actually can't pinpoint who's buried here whatsoever. We don't know who is actually buried here or not. It is possible they buried him outside of the old burying ground, just kind of through as he was a prisoner. But we can't say specifically where he was buried. But he was here. He was kind of seen in this kind of scoundrel light. It's kind of a bit of a ne'er-do-well, a troublemaker, so to speak.
Well, one of the things I opened with was some say he's the first communist, but you were saying it's wrong to project modern ideas onto 1740s.
The issue with putting modern labels onto things and ascribing modern terminology to people from the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, etc., is you're assigning them an identity, an idea, an understanding of concepts from a 21st century perspective, which they would not have had. The idea of assigning Christian Priber the very first communist, while you could perhaps kind of trace ideas in the sense of trying to create this community-based living, is assigning him basically a ideology that he would have had no understanding of whatsoever. It's not unlike people referring to John Brown, the person who raided Harper's Ferry in 1859, as the first terrorist, or the terrorist individual. That is a loaded term in a 20th century context that would have had no actual basis in the 1850s. And so you really have to kind of look at where people are coming from and understand their worldview before trying to assign any kind of modern label on it. It's akin to like someone trying to go back and say like, oh, well, so-and-so had this mental disease. You really can't do that because you don't have the ability to actually communicate with that person and understand what they may be going through or not.
So the Cherokee started listening. Now, Priber was a big proponent of Cherokee culture, but he talked about creating a possible tribal confederation among all people in the Southeast. In fact, he said that if this were to be done and they were to share all of their property in communal ownership, then they would be able to play off the influences of the three great empires at the time, Spain, France, and Britain. Now, in 1739, he started advocating for the safety of slaves who had escaped from the East Coast. He had started talking about the need to free the slaves and initiate these uprisings. So the British, of course, in 1739, they put a hit out on him. And of course, this was carried out by the Creek, who were kind of in a shaky relationship with the Cherokee. In fact, the Battle of Taliwa would be fought in 1755 over property ownership between those two tribes. And as he was making his way over to French New Orleans, probably as a refugee, he was captured in 1742. Now, a year later, he died here at Fort Frederica of smallpox, and he was buried in this cemetery behind me, the old burial grounds. None of the graves nowadays are marked. But it's fascinating to think that this man tried to truly unite the tribes of the Southeast, and to think of what would have happened if he were successful is a fascinating case study. And to also think that he was probably here during the bombardment by the Spanish in their invasion of 1742 is truly a nexus of history that has totally been forgotten by modern Georgia. And in the old cemetery here at Fort Frederica are the graves of Christian Gottlieb Priber, who tried to unite all of the tribes of the Southeast into one tribal confederation under a communistic order, as well as, very likely, the Spanish who died in the battles of Gully Hole Creek and Bloody Marsh, along with the Indian allies of Oglethorpe and men who just died of disease at the fort. Today, none of these graves are marked, but it's a fascinating echo of history in the deep marshes of the Southeast. An often overlooked character in the story of Christian Gottlieb Priber is the man who arrived to the very village that Priber would call his home base several years earlier in 1729. This is the story of Sir Alexander Coming. Now, his story goes back to the north of England. His father was a member of Parliament, he came from a very wealthy family, and a rival member of Parliament ensured that he would never practice law, even though that was his major. So his wife had a dream saying that he would go to America and live amongst the Cherokee. Sure enough, in 1729, he landed in the colony of Carolina and made his way to the foothills of the Cherokee to Grand Tellico, where Christian Gottlieb Priber would arrive a few years later. Now understand, at this point, there was no alliance between the English and the Cherokee. In fact, a couple years prior, they had sent out expeditions to pacify the tribes. And then here arrives this Scottish adventurer who, basically within a year, he is declared a chief of the Cherokee, and they really adopt him into the tribe. And not long after that, he gives the crown of Tanasi, something which he had designated, to a man who would thereby be called the Moitoi of Tellico, which the British recognized as basically the crown king of all Cherokee peoples. And he lived at the village of Grand Tellico. Now, eventually, Sir Alexander Coming would outlive his usefulness to the crown. Yes, he crafted this masterful alliance that would last them to the Revolutionary War with the natives in the area and the British, but he was also too eccentric. He tried offering every Jewish family in Europe a home here in the Appalachian Mountains, all 3 million of them. He decided to try to craft lead into gold. He practiced alchemy, even though that had not been an accepted practice for decades. And he sold land to settlers, which he never gave them. And then, when he proposed to the English monarchy that we could settle every Jewish family in Europe here in the Appalachian Mountains, they distanced themselves from him very greatly. But you can see that by living amongst the Cherokee and marrying into their tribe, they accepted him, much like they accepted Priber years later. And you could say that Sir Alexander Coming paved the way for Christian Gottlieb Priber. And when all the missionaries came up here to the mountains, they found that the Cherokee had very similar stories to the stories in the Bible. Well, it can easily be explained by the preaching of Priber and Alexander Coming, even if Priber wasn't himself a particularly religious man.